try and not to make this too salesy, but just a little bit of stuff about WhoSampled. We catalogue over 1,000 years of music, everything from Beethoven to Beyonce. We've got hundreds of thousands of tracks. You can look up pretty much any artist and find the history of their music through their influences and the people that they've sampled and so on. I'm going to kick off by giving you a fairly uncredible example, but just shows you a little bit of the sort of stuff you can find on the website. So first of all, this is a track, Duck Sauce, which you might remember as being a fairly naff dance record from a few years back. And that is based on a sample, some of you might know this already, from a track by Boney M, a disco track. So they made the massive creative leap of adding a kick drum to that record and adding the words Barbra Streisand. What you probably didn't know is that that record is a cover version of a track called Hallo Bimmelbahn by Night Train, which is a bit of a curious kind of German rocky pop record. So obviously sales of Hallo Bimmelbahn are going to skyrocket once you all leave the room. But it's just a bit of a kind of light-hearted intro to the idea that there's a story behind every record, and it's not always just this samples this, but quite often there's a kind of long chain of these things. There are more credible examples. There's a rap group called the legendary KO that did a mixtape track called George Bush Doesn't Care About Black People, which was based on Kanye West Gold Digger, and Kanye West Gold Digger sampled Ray Charles. The Ray Charles record was based on an old gospel track. The gospel track was based on a traditional workers' song. So there's all these kind of like threads of music history. If there's one thing to take away from this workshop today, it's this idea that citation and imitation has always led the way that music evolves. It's not just about sampling being something that came about in the last 20 or 30 years. All music that's existed ever has always been based on reinterpreting ideas that came before. So, you know, there's a few examples here in terms of genre, but you've got jazz influenced by the traditional music of immigrant populations coming to the US. You've got soul and rhythm and blues influenced by jazz and gospel music also. You've got funk influenced by all those things that came before, soul, R&B and jazz. Rock, of course, influenced by rhythm and blues. Disco grew out of soul and funk, and then hip-hop in a much more direct kind of way was influenced by funk and rock and soul and jazz initially, but eventually, essentially anything that could be sampled. That's a map. It was actually put together by Thompson, the Travel People, but it shows, it was kind of a viral thing they did, but it shows how all these different styles of music from all over the world are interconnected and how one feeds off another. So you can see kind of cross-pollination of like dance music genres over the years, and it's a great little tool. So we're looking essentially here though at more contemporary stuff. So sampling's been at the forefront of music for the last 30 years or so. Just a few examples there of albums that are predominantly sample based. But before we get to that, I just wanted to sort of dip back into time a little bit and show you something that goes back to the 1800s. So this is Waltz in C by Diabelli, and this is from 1819. And this is something that Beethoven came up with in 1820. It's pretty similar. That's not strictly how it should be presented. The Beethoven track is actually called Diabelli Variations, and it's him essentially remixing something that someone wrote a year before. And the only reason I'm playing it really just to give this idea that it's not just a kind of contemporary thing that people do this. For as long as there's been music, people have been kind of spotting ideas that other people have done and think, no, I like that, but maybe I could rework it in a certain way, do something slightly different. So in terms of sampling as a contemporary thing, there are examples going back to the sort of 1950s of people using little bits of radio broadcasts or field recordings and that sort of stuff in contemporary classical music. But really, in terms of like sampling as you and I would think of it, it all begins with turntables. Hip-hop's birth, 11th of August 1973. Not a lot of genres of music have like a specific birthday. Obviously, you know, modern styles of dance music have their kind of time periods where there's an inception, but hip-hop is generally thought to have kind of had its kickstart at a party that took place in the Bronx in August 1973 at the Recreation Centre at Sedgwick Avenue, when a DJ called Kool Herc, who was from West Indian background, brought his sound system there for this party, back to school jam, and played records in a way that hadn't really been done before. Just to sort of encapsulate what hip-hop meant in those early days, hip-hop began in 1973. No one released a hip-hop record until 1979. So for a period of 6 years, it existed purely as a kind of live art form. DJs and eventually party hosts, MCs and what have you. And hip-hop really was kind of like a rebel music, as were many styles of music before it. Jazz was considered rebel music. Rock and roll was considered rebel music. But hip-hop jams were a place where people played records that weren't really getting played elsewhere. You know, probably as black as music got on the radio in the 70s was disco, really. James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud wasn't the sort of record that was going to get radio play, but it would get played at these parties. Hip-hop really evolved out of using the tools available, turntables, basic mixers, microphones, to create a new form of music. Herc was playing like the popular funk records of the time, James Brown and what have you. And the revelation that he made was that there was parts in those records, and I guess anyone who plays dance music who's familiar with the idea of like the drop will understand this, but there was parts of the record that the crowd really, really responded to. And in funk records, that was typically the bit of the record where instrumentation fell away and the drummer was left to play solo. So I'll give you a classic example of that, which is James Brown's Funky Drummer.
Shake. I walk the floor. I wanna walk the floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, get it. Good.
So there you have it. So that's the break from James Brown's Funky Drummer, and that is a kind of hip-hop staple and would have been a staple of the parties at that time. So Herc's revelation, if you can call it that, was that there was this part in the record that the crowd really, really responded to. And his reaction to that was to try and work out, well, is there a way that I can extend that kind of magic moment? And what he did was, with 2 copies of the same record, in the most basic of ways with the equipment available at the time, was to just repeat that part of the record. So that would have been nothing more sophisticated really at that point in time than just playing out that section.
1, 2, 3, 4, get it. Good.
And then with just basic fades, you know, in quite repeat it over from the other side of from the next turntable.
1, 2, 3, 4, get it.
You know, as basic and kind of clumsy as that might be, that started a bit of a revolution in the way that DJs would play these records. So there's a few kind of steps in the process. So next up is Grandmaster Flash, a younger DJ, saw this, was excited by it, but felt like there had to be a way to do this that was more fluid, that didn't have these kind of clumsy breaks in it. He's often credited for creating the crossfader, by which you can cut from one record to the other. There was some high-end audio equipment at the time that already had similar kind of switches, but he knew a little something about electronics, and he realized that, you know, by marking up a record and by having a way of jumping directly from one to the other, not having to kind of fade in and out, you could, in fact, create a continuous rhythm. So this is the sort of thing that he was doing. So with kind of just very basic equipment, 2 turntables and a switch that allowed you to cut from one record to another, they'd created a new way of playing records that allowed these break sections in the record to be extended and played out in a kind of rhythmical fashion. The third piece of the puzzle comes from a third DJ, Grand Wizard Theodore, and he's largely thought to be responsible for the scratch. Again, there's a bit of folklore around this, how exactly it was done. Some people suggest that it's, you know, just from queuing up something in the headphone and rubbing the record backwards and forwards while you're waiting to find the right spot. You know, that has a certain sound to it, maybe that could be incorporated. I saw recently an interview where he was talking about practicing at home and his mum called him for dinner and he's standing there idly doing this and, oh, wait, that sounds great. Who knows? But one way or another, this idea of like rubbing the record backwards and forwards could become part of the performance. So like with the fader in the middle, you've got a basic, you can cut the fader away and just get the forward motion and then do combinations that incorporate both. Just to give you an example of that in practice. And then eventually, the two things can actually be put together. So there we have the kind of basic building blocks of hip hop and the advent of sampling as we know it today, taking fragments from records, presenting them in a way that is creating something new. The impact of the break is multiple, not just in music production, but breakdancing takes its name from that. At the parties where people were doing this kind of DJing, there would be hype men moving the crowd and all this sort of stuff, and that eventually evolved into rap as we know it, and the cultural movement of hip-hop gradually started to take shape. What I think is particularly interesting about this is, as I said, hip-hop started in 73, no one released a hip-hop record until 1979, and yet hip-hop exists, so, what were the records? And the records they were using really were incredibly eclectic. So a few examples here, James Brown's Funky Drummer we've already played. Billy Squire's The Big Beat, I'll play you a little bit of that. Not what you would think of as a hip-hop record, but first 4 bars of that record would probably be familiar to some of you, either because you're historic hip-hop fans or perhaps because you like Dizzy Rascal, but the opening bars of that record sound like this. So that small fragment of the record would have been a classic part of the kind of records that were played at these early hip-hop jams and the sort of backing track that rappers would be picking up on at the time. I'll give you one more example from Michael Viner's incredible Bongo Band. Again, not what you might typically think of as a hip-hop record, but it's actually a cover version of a record by The Shadows, a kind of classic rock and roll tune. So there again, classic breakdance record, in fact, classic backing track for some of the early hip-hop artists. Those of you into drum and bass might also recognize it. Play it on 45, it sounds like this. So it found a new lease of life later on. So as things progress, we get towards this point in time when people start releasing records. The first hip-hop track to appear on vinyl, in fact, was not by a hip-hop group, but was by Fatback Band with a rapper, Tim Third. Personality Jock is the name of the track, and it sounds like this.
All right, y'all, here we go. You just clap your hands and you stomp your feet, cause you're listening to the sound of the show shot beat. I'm the K-I-N-G, the G-I-M, King Tim the Third, and I am him, just me, Fatback, and the crew, we're doing it all.
Now, the fundamental difference there is that there aren't any samples in that track. It's played to the backing track played by the band, in this case, Fatback Band. And the same was true, really, of all the early rap records. The first record that was an entirely hip-hop record came later that year, Sugar Hill Rapper's Delight, which I'm sure you probably will recognize, which sounds like this.
said a hip hop, the hip it to the hip hop. You don't stop the rocker to the bang bang boogie. Say up jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat. Now what you hear is not a test. I'm rapping to the beat.
Now, what's different about that is that the band in this case are playing effectively replicating a record which would have been a popular record at those early hip hop jams. In this case, Good Times by Chic, which sounds like this. So what's happening here is, you know, we've got a live art form that becomes popular. Someone has the brainwave. This doesn't need to just be something that happens in parties. These could be records. Records start getting recorded, but the technology isn't really available to kind of recreate them as they would sound in the clubs or in the block parties or in the recreation centres. So a band who's used to playing this kind of stuff is effectively replicating the popular hits of the day for the rappers to do their thing over. And that, in a sense, is the first hip-hop sample. Not a sample as in directly taken from the record, but the first time someone's recreated in that sort of way, the groove from a particular record into another record. From this point onwards, this is where I think it starts to get interesting, is where the availability of equipment really changes the way everything's done. So, you know, for the first few years, we've got mostly kind of like disco-sounding rap records using bands in the way I just described. Drum machines start coming around in the early 80s. The 808 is a classic one used for nearly all the early electro records and in a lot of hip hop up until the mid 80s. And then when the mid 80s hit, we start seeing kind of affordable samplers that can actually sample direct from a record. The EMU SP12, SP1200, two very popular ones, and then eventually the Akai MPC60, which has got the classic 4x4 grid of pads that you're used to seeing on a lot of modern samplers. So just to give you a couple of examples of how some of those records sounded, early 80s, we've got a kind of very drum machine orientated sound. So this is a track by Jazzy J.
Jazzy J's in the place. Everybody look at the left side. Y'all just clap your hand like you said. Dig this. Clap, clap, clap. Come on. Clap your hands. And on the right side, y'all do the same stuff. Like y'all just clap on beat with people on the left side.
And those records were like incredibly sparse, pretty much just drum machines and rappers for a good few years. Like the kind of dominant sound in hip hop was just like that. Once affordable samplers came around and you could actually sample loops that would sound like the sort of things that were being played in the early parties, then things changed a little bit. So by the mid 80s, you've got people sampling breaks again. And this is an example by Kevy Kev and Ak B. And that's our old friend Funky Drummer again. And then there's some cross-pollination of those ideas as well. So you've got some examples sort of into the late 80s where they've got people using drum machines and samples together. So this is Run DMC sampling that same record, Funky Drummer again, but this time adding drum machines. And there you start to have this introduction to this idea of layering stuff. So in that case, it's just a very simple loop of one record with drum machines layered to it. But what comes next is where it kind of starts to beginnings of evolving into production as we know it now, which is to start layering samples. So this is Public Enemy from 1988.
Here's what I want you all to do for me.
Bang! Caught you looking for the same thing. It's a new thing. Check out this I bring. The roll below the level, cause I'm living low next to the bass. Come on! Turn up the radio.
And that's not a massively sophisticated piece of production, but it's an early example of layering lots of samples together. And the way they produce records came very much from turntables. So the production group Bomb Squad that produced those records would, by all accounts, quite often just jam on turntables or with samplers, just throwing stuff together and recording all of it and then finding the bits that worked. So there might be 3 or 4 things going on at the same time. So in that particular track, we've got drums from this record, Melvin Bliss, Synthetic Substitution, and they're just sped up a little bit. And then we've got a loop from James Brown, which provides the sort of bass line. And then we've got a third sample on top of that loop, which is the little squeal which comes from another James Brown record, Escapism. So there we start to get this kind of multi-layered kind of effect, which really is the kind of the bedrock of modern hip-hop production. So, you know, there we've got a couple of James Brown samples and a well-known funk record from the time. Things start to get more interesting as we go into the early to mid-90s when groups start kind of reaching out and sampling away from James Brown. You know, it kind of reached saturation point in the late 80s with everyone sampling James Brown. There was even a track called Stop Jocking James, I think it was called, which, you know, kind of inviting people to kind of look outside that comfort zone of those sort of tracks. But, you know, early 90s, people are kind of digging into other kind of groove-led records. So you've got an example here from Tribe Called Quest.
As we start trudging, me and my brothers, we be looking and be bugging. Vehicles of life, they be rolling and be nudging. Searching for the virgins of life, that be shoving at the door that's cracked. The valleys of time are always on my feet, at least the beat will combine the calluses and corns with a funky bass line. You won't need underdog for a nickel shoe shine on the shoes that's tapped. But can I get a level on the bass and on the treble? Footing up and down like a UNLV rebel.
And that is based on a loop from a track from Donald Byrd, a sort of jazz funk record called Think Twice, which sounds like this. And there's several well-known sample sections in that record that have been used by various different people. Chi Ali, I think, used this, and Main Source used this part of the record. So, you know, you start getting this kind of trend for sampling away from the classic funk records. It moves into jazz, jazz funk, and so on. Mid-90s, I think it kind of reaches its pinnacle in a way. And I want to play you one example that kind of, I think, encapsulates it pretty well, which is a track by Lord Finessis from around 95. And that sounds like this. And one of the reasons I chose that as an example is I think it demonstrates quite well this idea of not just looking at loops. Up until this point, we'd had people sampling loops from jazz funk records, and before that, loops from funk records, and so on. And for the most part, people were kind of taking whole 2 or 4 bar chunks and looking for stuff that sounded a little bit like instrumental hip hop. But the record that he sampled here really doesn't, and I'm going to play it for you now. It's by Oscar Peterson. And I think what's interesting about that is it kind of takes a bit of, you know, it seems fairly obvious looking at things now, but at the time takes a bit of a kind of mental leap to imagine how that might sound like a hip hop record. So he's taken drums from this record, Detroit Emeralds. And then what he's done is selected a couple of small fragments out of the Oscar Peterson record. So first of all this, and then this. And when you add them to the drums, it starts to sound like what you heard on the original record. And then there's a few other elements in there as well. There's just very low down in the mix, there's some sleigh bells, which was a popular thing used quite heavily in mid-90s hip-hop. Usually taken from one of a couple of records. One of them is Average White Band, the other one is actually a Christmas record. So you have the sleigh bells, and then there's also a little James Brown kind of grunt or scream in there. So then when you put all those elements together, plus there's some horn stabs and some other little bits of layering in there, but
I'm hip to the game. I'll always be the same. 'Cause when I'm broke, I got fame, sunshine, and rain.
so for me that's kind of like the leap from just loops to production. And what he's essentially done there is put together a band. You know, he's got Oscar Peterson playing his melody, he's got the drummer from the Detroit Emeralds playing his drums, he's got whoever played the sleigh bells in Millie and Silly playing his sleigh bells, he's got James Brown doing some ad-libs, he's got his own vocals on there. And at this point, like, a hip-hop producer is more like what a producer in a band would be like. You know, a producer in a band would be like, okay, you play drums like this and you play the bass like this. A hip-hop producer in this context is really doing the same thing, but he's got at his fingertips the best musicians from this band and this jazz guy and this funk guy, and he's kind of putting it all together in a way that really is more production than it is just loops and beat making. So at this point, it's kind of really taken a departure from the DJing genesis, and it's become something entirely new. Just a nice little side story here, a record that came from some UK producers in the early 90s. They did a record that sampled called I think Flip Fantasia, which sampled Cantaloupe Island by Herbie Hancock, which is a classic jazz record, the one I'm playing now. And it was a sort of surprise hit. It kind of got very popular. People started to find out about it, and Blue Note learned about the sample, and that's the point where things would normally get a little bit sticky. But Blue Note, being a label with a lot of heritage in jazz, but also being quite forward-thinking, found out about the sample and said, actually, you know what, this could be good for us. So they, rather than kind of come down heavy on them and said, look, we actually like the record, we'll put the record out, and not just that, but we'll let you sample whatever you like from our back catalogue. So they gave this band free reign on anything from Blue Note, and then they produced an album made entirely of Blue Note samples, and ended up being a gold record. Anyway, to get back to the story, what you've heard so far has been pretty much focused in hip-hop entirely, but these kind of trends started to evolve outside of hip-hop. So you've got, you know, house music starts to come around during a similar time period, late 80s, and the focus there was much more on sampling disco records. You know, soul stuff in particular was very popular. This is First Choice, a classic soul disco record, which has been sampled hundreds of times in house music. House music, particularly in the UK, evolved then into hardcore and drum and bass, which was, you know, fusion of break beats, the same break beats that hip-hop was using, with house music. And then out of that eventually grew drum and bass. And again, with drum and bass and jungle, a lot of the records that were being sampled were the same as the early hip-hop records. So this is actually the most sampled record of all time, Amen Brother by the Winstons, which is a pretty up-tempo kind of funk track. And those of you with a good ear might recognise the drums, and there's the classic drum break. About 2/3 of the way into the record, it breaks down to just the drums, and they sound like this. If you've ever heard one or more jungle records, I'm pretty sure you will recognise those drums straight away. If you speed them up, they sound like this. And then there's, you know, similar trends in other styles of UK music. UK garage had a kind of real love affair with sampling acapellas from 90s R&B records. And pop music, in one form or another, sampled pretty much anything, starting with the popular sources. A lot of, you know, there's break beats in Spice Girls records, there's break beats in Justin Bieber records, you know, all sorts. It really is kind of not just this niche thing that hip-hop guys do, but it's very much like the fabric of popular music. Today, we've got no longer the restrictions of the early equipment, really. You know, if you've got a computer, if you own a computer, you own a sampler, basically. Sometimes the limitations of that early gear is the reason why the music sounded the way it did. The SB12, which Lord Finesse would have used to create that track that I played you earlier, had terrible sample time. You'd only get a couple of seconds in there. So the way to do it was to speed the records up and sample them real fast and then slow it all down so that you had more sample time to play with. The reason so many 90s records in hip hop had those little short horn stabs was just that's all you had to do. You know, you had a small amount of sample time. Now, pretty much, you know, the possibilities are endless. Software's cheap and affordable, and, you know, outboard gear is comparatively cheap. So it's, you know, progressing at a crazy rate. And, you know, it's resulted in some real interesting and some real abstract music. This is just one example. This is Flying Lotus. He's from LA, and he's sampling a contemporary LA composer, Miguel Atwood Ferguson, a record released just the same year. So, like, it's almost like the cycle's tightening. You know, you can sample stuff that was made yesterday. You can release it tomorrow on SoundCloud. You can do whatever. So just to kind of wrap things up and kind of pull a bit of that together, you know, some of the classic stuff that's been the bedrock of all this stuff continues to be super popular. On the flip side of that, so you've got, you know, artists like the Beatles have been covered 3,500 times. James Brown's been sampled more than 10,000 times. And it's almost, with some of those classic samples, like they almost become like a kind of currency. It's not really about sampling something rare or obscure or no one will know what this is. It's almost like these are kind of part of the language of modern music. And just to kind of wrap it up with some stats from the site, so you've got artists like Girl Talk, whose entire career is built around sampling really easily identifiable bits of other people's music. You've got a heritage hip hop producer like Dr. Dre, who went through all of that period we talked about earlier, from electro right through to the current day. You've got contemporary artists like Kanye West, whose entire music is based around, well, largely based around samples. And then you've got cover versions on X Factor every Saturday night. You've got popular shows like Glee, which are basically based around cover versions. You've got pop songs, you know, long-term hits based off samples. Oliver Cheatham's a bit of an outdated example, but I mean, just to give you a contemporary example, something like Drake's Hotline Bling.
You used to call me on my... You used to. Yeah. You used to call me on my cell phone. Late night when you need.
And that's based on Timmy Thomas. Which is, you know, it's good news for Drake, but it's even better news for Timmy Thomas. So that kind of brings us up to date with, you know, how it's gone from this kind of underground thing that happened in a block party in New York to pretty much the fabric of pop music. You look at the Grammys, you look at the Brits, you look at the top 10 on any given week, like pretty much 2/3 or more of that music is based on samples in some form, or it's a cover version, or it's a remix. But you can find out more by visiting the website, WhoSampled.com. My personal site is musicofsubstance.com. If you're more interested in the kind of historical hip-hop stuff, I have a website, classicmaterial.co.uk, where you can listen to music from different years and see how all this stuff evolved. And that's where I wrap it up. So thanks from me and from James.
1, 2, 3, 4, get it!